Today's video is a disturbing one, with some incredible stories. We'll be starting things off with a story involving a blackout in an apartment complex. Then a story about a night watchman in a landfill. Then closing things off with a great story involving a video game. It gave me some classical creepypasta vibes while I was reading it, so I hope you guys enjoy it as well. A huge thank you to the writers, whose links can be found in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, feel free to support it with a like and a comment letting me know your thoughts. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Severe thunderstorm warning for the following counties. It was late at night on Saturday when I was greeted with the severe thunderstorm warning plastered over top of my favorite show. I didn't have work tomorrow, so I decided to stay up later than normal and mess around a bit. I groaned as I was forced to sit and listen to the warning in its entirety. Seek shelter immediately and stay indoors until farther notice. After the warning had finally left the screen, I watched TV for around 2 to 3 hours, before getting up reluctantly off my sofa to pour myself a cup of coffee. As I was halfway through pouring my cup, the power to my apartment had cut out, leaving me in pitch black darkness. "Aw man," I said to myself. I set the cup down on the counter and pulled my phone out to turn my flashlight on. As I was doing this, I noticed I didn't have any signal either. Guess the storm's pretty severe after all. I muttered to myself. Usually whenever we get warnings like this, the storm would pass right by our small town and head to the others. The way the apartment was set up, each building had its own breaker box next to the maintenance room, just on the left of the entrance door. If power went out to a single unit, the owner could simply knock on the door to the maintenance room and ask if they can reset the switch. I wanted to know if and when the power will come back on. So I made my way out of my apartment, shining the flashlight down the hall. I never really left my apartment at night, and never have I had a blackout happen here. The hallway seemed dark, eerie, and just put out a negative vibe that sent a chill down my spine. After checking my surroundings for a little, I decided to venture out towards the end of the corridor. As I walked, I noticed that it was more quiet than normal. Usually the building was quiet, but never like this. A light buzzing noise started filling my ears to try to drown out the silence. All that could be heard was my footsteps, and pant legs brushing against each other with each step I took. A few steps in, I started feeling a little lightheaded and dizzy. Everything felt as though it were spinning. I quickly regained my composure, however, when I heard what sounded like a tearing noise followed by some loud cracking, as if bones were being broken. I figured it was just the thunder and rain outside, and continued on. As I reached the end of the hall, I walked up to the maintenance room door and started knocking softly. "Hey, any word on when the power will come back?" I paused and looked down at my feet after noticing light reflecting off the ground from my phone's flashlight. I aimed the beam of light down at the ground. There was a dark pool surrounding my foot. Unsure at first of what the fluid was, I bent down to get a closer look, and saw that it was a deep crimson color. Blood. My heart started to beat hard in my chest as I got back up. I stood there for a second with thoughts racing in my head on what I should do. So I decided to try and open the door. I very slowly and shakily reached my hand out to the knob to twist it, but it wouldn't move. It was locked. My next instinct was to call the police, but as I started to dial 911, I felt as though there were eyes on me coming from everywhere around me. I finished dialing and pressed call, held the phone up to my ear, and was greeted with a woman on the other end.
911, where's your emergency?
The female operator asked me in a calm, collected voice. I live at 896 Terrace Grove, apartment 12 in building C. I replied shakily.
Okay, and what's the nature of your emergency?
She asked. I went to ask the maintenance guy when the power will come back on, but when I got to the door, I saw a pool of blood coming from under it. My voice became increasingly panicked and shaky. I started to hyperventilate a little, not feeling alone or safe where I was standing. I started to head back to my apartment when I saw it.
Okay, sir. Help is on the way. I need you to stay on the...
The operator continued to talk to me over the phone, but I couldn't bring myself to reply as I stared at the being in front of me. It was tall, much taller than any human being, with long, jagged-looking arms that looked as if they were mangled and disfigured. Its feet looked more like bony talons, bloody, cracked, bony talons. I couldn't get a good view of it, as the light of my phone was shining on the wall next to me, as the operator raised her voice to get my attention.
Sir, hello. Are you there?
She asked nervously, worried that something had happened to me, and at that moment, I was worried that something would happen to me. The creature then snapped its neck, leaving its head resting on one of its shoulders. As it stared at me with empty sockets, I grasped my phone and yelled as I ran down the hallway back to the maintenance room door, jiggling the handle frantically to get in. I turned to see where the being was, and saw that it was running towards me. It was fast, way faster than I could run. The way it ran looked as if its legs were broken. It was limping and stumbling, but it never fell. As it got closer to me, I kicked the door a few times, until the frame keeping it locked snapped. I quickly ran inside and slammed the door next to me. It smelled bad in the room. I shined my light around to get a good look at my surroundings, and froze as I saw the maintenance guy on the floor, his body a mangled mess of skin and organs. His eyes were gone, just 2 empty sockets remained.
Sir, are you okay? What's going on?
I had forgotten I dialed 911. I raised the phone back up to my ear, trying my best to speak coherently. There's something in the building. It killed the maintenance guy. I'm in the maintenance room right now. Please hurry. I said while choking back tears. After I caught my breath, I screamed as I felt the door start to be pushed open. The creature outside was trying to make its way in. I screamed more as I tried to keep the door shut. The 911 operator could do nothing but listen to my shrill cries of terror and fear as I fought for my life to keep this thing out. "Sheriff's office, get on the ground," I heard from down the hall. The police were finally here. I felt a little more at ease finally, but quickly grew fearful again once I heard one of the officers scream out in a muffled, staticky sounding way. "What is that?" After this, I heard the sound of a gun being fired at whatever was out there. I quickly ducked down and laid in the puddle of blood under me, trying to avoid getting shot. After a while of this, I heard nothing outside but the footsteps of the police walking towards the door. As they got closer and closer, I felt everything around me start to spin and contort. It was overwhelming. Then everything started to go blacker and blacker, until I had passed out on the floor, in the pool of the maintenance guy's blood. I woke up in the emergency room sometime after. I was in a hospital gown, and hooked up to some sort of IV drip. I was confused at first, but quickly remembered the events of the night and early morning. That's when a nurse walked into my room, saw that I was awake, and ran out to get a doctor. After several minutes, he walks into the room holding a clipboard. "Mr. McKinley, how are you feeling?" he asked as he approached my bedside. "A little shaken up, but fine otherwise," I replied. "Do you know where you are right now?" he asked me again, in a tone that implied that I may not know where I was. "Yeah, I'm in the hospital," I answered. "Okay, do you know what happened last night?" he asked as he pulled up a chair and sat down, facing me. I relayed everything that I remember about that night, the storm coming, the blackout, the maintenance room, and it. He looked at me solemnly as if he were upset with my response, and said softly, "I'm sorry, but that's not what happened last night," he said with sorrowful eyes. I looked at him confused. "I saw everything that happened. I know what I saw." "You seem to have been hallucinating. There was never any thunderstorm warning or blackout. According to what your neighbors and police saw, you walked out of your apartment with your phone light on, and went into the maintenance room and..." He sighed and continued. Mr. McKinley, due to a lack of sleep you've been experiencing combined with an apparent high amount of caffeine in your system, you suffered a psychotic blackout last night. One in which you seem to have hallucinated and, out of some sort of aggression you had, well, you murdered Mr. Springer, the maintenance man, called 911 speaking incoherently. My jaw dropped as he continued to speak. How could any of this have happened? That's not what happened last night. I know what happened. I was almost killed by some demonic being. When the police arrived, they saw you standing in front of the door. They shouted at you to drop the knife you used, and shot you in the leg and abdomen. You hallucinated everything that night, Mr. McKinley. The blackout, the creature, everything. It would seem all that you saw and heard was piggybacking off of what was really happening. I stared in silence, not sure of what to say or how to react. I noticed movement behind him in the hallway. I looked past him and noticed the creature was standing there, staring at me with its empty eye sockets, smiling at me with a broken smile. On the surface, the idea of having a security guard for thousands of tons of trash is ridiculous, right? I wasn't sure why they'd require a watchman at such a godforsaken place, but I needed a job and it paid well. There were several reasons for the high wages. First of all, the stench is both constant and overwhelming. Anyone who's ever been to a dump knows that hideous smell. You honestly worry that the pervasive stink will follow you home after you leave. It absolutely does. Luckily, I have a poor sense of smell and don't mind showering twice a day. Even then, I have to wear nose plugs while on duty. The other reasons were never disclosed to me, but believe me, they become readily apparent later. On my first day, I was shown the ropes by the daytime security guy. He showed me where everything was in the office and explained what my required duties were on the grounds. As darkness approached, he seemed quite anxious to leave. I assumed that was because it was a frickin' garbage dump. No mystery to that, but later, I realized there was more to it. Considerably more. I had nightly paperwork to fill out, and was supposed to make 2 full walking rounds around the premise during my shift. Derek, the day shift guy, seemed visibly nervous when he walked out. He hesitated for a brief moment and told me to call if I had any trouble. I didn't get a chance to inquire what sort of trouble I might have. It's not like it's a bank, for heaven's sake. It's a stinking landfill, and the facility is closed to the public at night. There aren't any deliveries. I heard Derek's tires squeal in the gravel parking lot when he left. All of a sudden, it was just me and countless acres of rotting garbage when the sun went down. What issues could there be? Scavengers? There are plenty of people who bring in 2 bags of household trash and leave it here with a carload of found treasure. Those people are gross, but they seemed harmless enough. Every landfill has scavengers who dig through mounds of trash, but that would normally occur during the day when the gates are wide open. I went back inside to escape the brunt of the stench. The entire waste management property has a 10-foot tall razor wire fence surrounding it like a prison campground. It was hard to imagine anyone scaling it at night to sift through piles of discarded debris, but Derek clearly knew something I didn't. Even more bizarre was that I was required to possess a firearm license. Just the thought of possibly having to prove my marksmanship against crazy rednecks and salvage hounds made me very uneasy. Why would the property owners care if some ghoul came to dumpster dive? It didn't make sense. I rationalized that it was probably due to an accident liability issue. Their insurance policy had to cover daytime incidents of people getting hurt during official landfill hours, but at night, when the gates were closed, it was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Still, why would I need a license for concealed carry? Was I supposed to fire a warning shot at anyone trying to break in? I would have expected them to explain their concerns and security policies better. Obviously, Derek wasn't one to go into great detail, as he tore out of the parking lot. I figured I'd just try to keep a cool head and deal with any terse situation that came up with common sense. On my first circuit walking around the compound that night, I noticed something very odd. The barbs at the top of the fence were all pointing inward. If the point was to keep people out, that was going to be much less effective. Fortunately, the smell lessened a bit after the sun went down, and it cooled off, but trust me, it still wasn't like walking through a rose garden. I heard shifting and various creaks within the nearby piles of trash. Obviously, there are thousands of mice and rats living in the festering filth, but the noises I heard sounded like much larger animals. I knew snakes and scavenger birds would be drawn to the place, as a rodent or hunting ground, but I assumed most of that occurred in better light. The sounds of garbage shifting and piles falling over was unsettling. A few times I directed my flashlight beam in the general direction, and it would stop, at least momentarily. I saw plenty of angry red eyes in the debris, but I wasn't about to interrupt their nightly routine or confront them. This was their home. Live and let live. Back at the office, I sat down and recorded the time of my rounds. Even with the AC running, I could still hear the piles of trash falling over in the distance. Obviously, it was a bustling metropolis for the night creatures that lived there. Neither Derek nor the man who hired me warned me about any of that. I shrugged to myself. It wasn't a big deal. I knew that any place that malodorous would attract a plethora of unwelcome inhabitants. Despite my thin reassurances, the sounds started to worry me as they grew more frequent. Some seemed incredibly close to the building, too. I gazed out the window at enormous hills of squalor and rot. A single security light shined over the first few hundred yards. I caught the gleam of a tin can rolling down a mound of debris. The reason for its movement wasn't obvious at first, but I assumed rats or other animals were bustling around under the surface. Just as I was about to look away in diminished interest, the objects at the top of the pile began to shimmy and shake. I pulled up a chair to witness what I assumed was either a gopher or Norway rat. Instead, a human hand breached the surface and shot skyward. I couldn't even blink at first. Not only did the hand and arm wrangle free of the tangled debris, but so did the owner's horribly mangled head. If that wasn't shocking enough, seeing the rest of the body took the cake. My jaw dropped in disbelief. The person was clearly deceased. He had to be. Even from that distance, I could see several bullet wounds visible. I am witnessing a reanimated corpse rise from the dead. Obviously, the garbage dump was not sacred ground, and the corpse was very restless. Like a light bulb going off, I finally understood why I was required to carry a gun, and why Derek was so anxious to leave. All of a sudden, another corpse started wiggling free of the trash. The first one was almost out of his makeshift burial plot, and seemed intent on heading for the fence. In all, I counted at least 5 well-dressed bodies in the debris. They all looked newly dead. Someone was using the landfill to get rid of people they didn't like. I didn't know for sure, but the Italian waste management family who owned the property seemed like they might know who these undead corpses were, and how they came to be there. Even I wasn't dumb enough to ask any questions about it. Instead, I grabbed my pistol and an extra clip. I needed to finish what hadn't been handled properly before. It was the sensitive, undisclosed part of the job. The next morning, Derek arrived and came into the office to replace me. He had a very relieved look on his face when he saw that things apparently went okay for me during my first night shift. I told him I had to shoot 5 rats. He nodded at the subtle code. Then I told him where they were buried. We both knew that if we didn't want to find ourselves under tons of debris, we needed to maintain the facade and do our jobs quietly. Some days I have to shoot at least a dozen rats. Other days are slow, and there are only a couple. But I've come to accept that my job with the landfill organization is a permanent one. I was devastated when my Uncle Matt died. My grandparents found themselves unintentionally pregnant with Matt in their 40s, and 4 years later, my mom had me. So the age gap between us was pretty small. We basically grew up together. He was like my older brother. What makes me sad now is how much we drifted apart when he went to college. And then we drifted even farther apart when I did the same thing a few years later. We would catch up every now and then, but every time we spoke, we somehow always wound up just reminiscing about our childhoods. The time we built a makeshift treehouse that fell apart while we were both inside. Or the first time we stole from Grandpa's liquor cabinets and took a sip of bourbon. Or the time we slid ourselves down the stairs in sleeping bags, and Matt ended up winded with a cracked rib. Then one day I received the news. It was so unexpected and so completely ridiculous that I couldn't even imagine it. Matt was dead at 33. My mom told me that the cause was terminal cardiac event, but she seemed tense and scared while she told me. At the funeral, I overheard her talking to my Aunt Carol. They were speculating about how a 30-something-year-old person could unexpectedly die of heart failure, with no prior medical conditions. My mom said that she thought it was all made up, and that the doctors had kept something secret. She leaned into Aunt Carol and managed to whisper the words. I saw his face. Before they were interrupted by my grandpa and I stopped eavesdropping. I remember leaving the funeral with a cold fear in the pit of my stomach. I saw his face. The words kept repeating in my head for the rest of the night. I dreamt of Matt's rigid corpse floating through an icy lake. A twisted look of horror contorting his features. I was swimming towards him, but I wasn't getting anywhere. I could only watch as he sank lower and lower into the dark depths and was eventually swallowed up by the blackness. The inheritance was all decided internally by the family, because he hadn't left a will. Matt obviously didn't think he'd need one just yet, so we had to divide everything up fairly as a family. Everyone agreed that it would only make sense for me to take Matt's video games and consoles, since we'd spent the better part of the 90s and early 2000s playing them together. I accepted, but I put them immediately into the basement. I couldn't face them. Facing them meant accepting that Matt was gone, and I'd somehow avoided doing that so far. It finally hit me a few months later in the weirdest of ways. I was out with a few friends at a new burger joint. It was so awesome and so delicious, and my first thought was to tell Matt. Then I realized that I couldn't, and I completely shut down. I cried right there in the restaurant in front of all my friends. I'm not the kind of guy who cries in public, so no one really knew how to react. Instead, they just let me leave. No one tried to stop me, and I'm honestly glad that they didn't. I spent the next few days away from work, away from my friends, and just generally away from my life. Everyone reached out to me and offered their help, but I casually rebuffed them and told them that I just needed time and space. I don't know why or exactly when I decided that it was time to dig Matt's stuff out of the basement, but I brought it all up to my room and started unpacking everything. First came all the new stuff, most of which I already had my own copies of, and then I slowly wound my way through the boxes, like I was taking a journey back in time. We loved horror games the most, especially during the PS1 era. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Clock Tower were easily some of the scariest. I dug them all out, looking at them fondly, but also with a tight knot in my stomach. These weren't just old games, but the exact copies we played as kids. He'd kept them all these years later, and still in pretty good condition. I hooked the old discolored PlayStation up to a TV of Matt's that I'd also inherited. Something he'd used to play retro games as authentically as possible. My plan was to spend the rest of the day playing through some old games, loading up old saves and crying until I started to feel better. I opened the top of the console and found out that there was already a disc inside. It looked like it was upside down, with the shiny black readable surface facing up. I took it out and flipped it, but it was the same on both sides, a blank disc. I was already interested to see what was on it, so I started up the console as I rummaged around to try and find its case mixed in with everything else that I'd unpacked. The all too familiar sound of the PlayStation played in my ears as I unearthed the blank case at the bottom of one of those boxes. I opened it and a piece of folded paper fluttered to the floor. I unfolded it and read the words scribbled there. "Don't say I didn't warn you." A sound started playing from the TV. A sound I didn't recognize. It was a low, crackling sound in all its 16-bit glory. I turned to see a black screen with the word START written in red in the center. There was no title, no artwork, nothing. I hesitated but pressed start. A white loading bar started to slowly fill the bottom of the screen. The game eventually loaded onto a first-person view of a living room. Everything had the kind of janky aesthetic that was normal to a 90s PlayStation game. Polygons seemed to warp as I looked around the room, and the textures were shaky and low res. That being said, the game looked pretty good for something that was at least 20 years old. There were moody lighting effects and foggy darkness in the room, which was well used and atmospheric. I moved the analog sticks and looked around the room, the sound of the character's footsteps stirring something strongly nostalgic in me. The room I was in was sparsely decorated. There was a scrap of paper on the coffee table. I pointed the crosshair at it and pressed X. He who fights with monsters should be careful, lest he thereby becomes a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. The words appeared on the screen in a plain white font, just long enough for me to read them. Then they abruptly disappeared, and wouldn't come back up again, no matter how many times I mashed the X button. I searched the room a little, and found a key, which I picked up with a simple on-screen message. You got the old key. I used it on the only door in the room, and an animation played, just like the old Resident Evil games, where the character opened the door and walked through. When the game loaded back in, I was stood in a dark hallway, and there was a strange sound coming from somewhere, like a dog trying to cough up a hairball. I walked down the hall, attempting to open all the doors along the way, only to find that each door produced the same message. The door is locked, keep going. As I continued, a strange music started building like the crash of waves. A loud note that then tailed off into something almost like static. As the music grew louder, so did the strange coughing sound. I reached a doorway that was already open into a room with a light on. The light spilled out into the hallway in an effect that was pretty impressive for this old of a game. As I turned the corner and stepped into the room, the music and weird coughing noise both stopped unexpectedly, leaving me in a tense and pervading silence. There was another character in the room. An NPC stood in perfect stillness. He was low polygon, and had only basic textures, but I recognized him all the same. He looked almost exactly like Matt, in his characteristic gray hoodie and black jeans. I approached the character and pressed X. You shouldn't have come. The words came up on the screen, and my eyes barely had time to register them before they flickered and changed. You should have come. I felt an unease creeping up my spine. I pressed X again, and the words changed again. Have you looked behind you? I spun around, not in the game but in real life, my heart thumping in my chest. There was nothing there. I turned back to the screen and the words had changed without my input. I said, have you looked behind you? I pressed X and the words disappeared, giving me the freedom to move my character again. I turned him around and a piercing sound started to play. The doorway was still there, but it didn't lead back into the hallway anymore. It led into a different room. I turned back again, but Matt, or whatever it was, wasn't there anymore. I moved into the next room and nearly dropped the controller when I recognized it. Despite the low textures and the basic graphics, it was Matt's living room. Exactly his living room. I'd only been there a handful of times in person, but I recognized it the second I walked in there. The lighting was low and there was static coming from the TV, which provided the only light in the room. There was a new character in the room, sitting on the sofa this time with her head turned towards the TV. It was my mom. I moved towards her and tapped X. Your mother watches the television with a look of happiness on her face. I pressed X again and the words disappeared. I tried again, but the results were the same. Instead, I turned my attention to the television and pressed X when I was close enough. The television shows a happy video, the words said, but all I could see on the screen was static. It's a video of you being bathed as an infant. Your father's hand suddenly covers your face and pushes you under the water, holding you there while you cry and thrash against him. The words disappeared and I regained control, but the controller slipped through my clammy hands. I took a deep breath and picked it back up, pressing X on the television again. Your deceased infant body floats face down in the water. I turned back to my mom, who was still sat on the sofa. I approached her and pressed X again. Your mom loves this video. She finds it hilarious. The words disappeared from the screen, and a 16-bit recording of my mom's laugh played out of the TV speakers, but it sounded almost like a scream. I leaned forwards and hovered my hand over the power button on the PlayStation. I wondered if I should keep playing. Maybe this was a practical joke. I looked back at the screen and found the screen focused on another new character. This time it was me. Don't touch that dial. The words came up on the screen exactly as I hit the power button. The console turned off and I breathed a sigh of relief before I opened the lid and took the disc out, hurling it across the room. It hit the wall, and a large section of it broke off. I hurried upstairs and crawled into bed. It was still light outside, but I was emotionally exhausted and shaking with fear. I lay there for what felt like hours, with silent tears running down my face until, eventually, somehow, mercifully, I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night with the sense that something was wrong. I groped for my phone in the darkness and found it, shining the light of the screen around the room to find that I was alone. I laid back and exhaled sharply, grateful that my fear was nothing more than the tail end of, well, whatever I'd experienced earlier in the day. Then I heard it. It was the same bizarre music, the sound building, then hitting a crescendo like the crash of a wave before subsiding into crackling static. It was coming from downstairs. I called the police, but every time the call connected I got nothing but static. I called my mom and had to stifle a yelp of joy when she answered the phone.
Hello?
She said, sounding chipper, "Mom, it's Charlie." I said in a harsh whisper, "Call the police. Ask them to come to my house and..."
I saw a funny video.
She cut me off, laughing to herself.
Your dad was drowning you. Do you remember that, honey?
"Mom, what are you..."
I wish he had, sweetie.
She said in a gentle tone.
He never wanted you. Neither did I. You should've...
I ended the call and dialed the police again. It was just the same static on the other end. In my frustration, I threw my phone. I hurled it through the bedroom door and out into the hall, where it bounced and tumbled on the floor until it came to a rest at the top of the stairs. I can't tell you how long it took me to build up the courage to move. It might have been minutes, but it felt like a lot longer. I'd like to say I walked, tall and brave, to the top of the stairs, but the truth is I crawled. I crawled so slowly that I was barely moving, all the while listening to that horrible music coming from downstairs. I reached my phone and picked it up. I tried to call another number in my contacts. Anyone. It didn't even matter who. But all I got was static. I tried to get onto the internet, but nothing was working. I was just beginning to consider trying to climb out of an upstairs window, when a voice called up to me from downstairs, chilling me to my bone. "Hey buddy, you up there? It's Uncle Matty." It was his voice, unmistakably his. But something was wrong. He was never that perky, and he sure as hell would never have called himself Uncle Matty. Not to any of his nieces and nephews, but least of all not to me. "Are you coming down, sport? I feel like playing a game." I don't know why I started to walk down the stairs, or where I found the courage to do it, but something had taken hold of me by that point. It was a compulsion I couldn't resist. My heart was beating so hard and so fast in my chest that I was finding it hard to breathe. I reached the bottom of the stairs, walked a few steps into the living room. I was alone, but the TV was on. The screen was black, so the glow was dark, but it was definitely on. And so was the PlayStation. The disc wasn't where I'd left it, although the large chunk that had broken off was still there. I bent down to pick it up when my mom's distorted 16-bit laughter came out of the TV again, making me jump and forcing me to stand bolt upright. My fight-or-flight response was in high gear, and I was trembling from the adrenaline, or maybe from the fear. Probably both. Words started to come up on the screen. This is my greatest work. I poured my heart, my blood, my very soul into this. They gave me 4 days. They said just 4. So that's what you get. Say goodbye to the people you love. 4 days. The music reached the same wave-crashing crescendo again, Except it didn't have a chance to trail off into static this time. It ended as suddenly as it had before, only this time it was for a different reason. I squinted against the sunlight that beamed through the slits in my blinds, and groggily sat up in bed. My phone was next to me. There were no calls dialed from the night before. I threw off the duvet and hurried downstairs, to find the broken disc exactly where it had fallen the day before. I took a shower, got dressed, and decided that I needed to get out of the house. Whatever had happened the day before, whatever I had seen, I didn't know how much of it was real, or how much of it was imagined. Had my grief really twisted my perception so much that I couldn't tell the difference between fantasy and reality? I decided I didn't really want to know the answer to that. I didn't want to know what I'd seen on that disc. Maybe there was nothing. Maybe I'd been pressing buttons on a black screen. I didn't want to think about it anymore. So I put on my coat and headed for the door. My hand was barely an inch from the handle when my phone buzzed and a text came through. I looked at the screen and my blood turned cold again. It was a single message from Matt. "Don't forget. 4 days, buddy."